At my brother's wedding reception, my dad grabbed the microphone and declared, "Mason has always been my greatest disappointment." At my brother Adrian's wedding reception, my father lifted the microphone and said, "I need everyone here to know that Mason has always been my biggest disappointment." He delivered the sentence in the middle of what was supposed to be a toast, while nearly 200 guests sat frozen with champagne glasses suspended in the air. I was standing near the cake table when he pointed directly at me and kept going. He is 28 years old and still rents a studio apartment, while his brother just married a surgeon. Adrian got into Yale, and Mason went to a state school. Adrian runs marathons, and Mason can barely run far enough to catch a bus. The wedding coordinator stepped forward and reached for the microphone, but my father pulled it away from her as though she were trying to steal something he had earned. No one laughed. No one even seemed to breathe. My new sister-in-law, Anika, started to rise from her chair, but my father was nowhere near finished. "I have 3 sons," he announced, scanning the room as if he were delivering a clever punchline. "2 of them make me proud every single day. Can anyone guess which one does not?" My youngest brother, Bryce, had been recording the speeches for Adrian, and his phone was still pointed toward the front of the room. My Aunt Diane tried to catch my father by the arm, but he brushed her away. Then he brought up the previous summer's family reunion and claimed that when my grandfather fell, I had been the only person who refused to help. He said I had simply stood there while everyone else handled the emergency. That was a lie, and every relative who had been there knew it. I had been the one who called emergency services, while my father shouted useless instructions, and my brothers froze. Even then, I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that correcting him rarely stopped an attack. It usually gave him more material. The wedding coordinator made another attempt to take the microphone. My father raised his voice over her and declared that he had earned the right to speak at his own son's wedding. Guests near the back began lifting their phones to record. Annika's parents sat rigid at their table, and I watched her mother grip her husband's wrist as though she were physically holding him in his chair. My father paused to take a slow sip of wine, then continued. "Adrian bought a house at 30. Mason rents a box with a hot plate. You do the math and decide which son I brag about at the office." He laughed at his own line, but the room remained silent. My mother finally reached him, wrestled the microphone from his hand, and began apologizing to everyone. My father did not look embarrassed. He stepped down from the front and walked straight toward me, still carrying his wine. "You are ruining your brother's day by making this about you," he said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. I stared at him because I genuinely had not spoken. "I have not said a word," I answered quietly. He looked me up and down with open disgust. "Your presence is enough. Look at that cheap suit. Your brothers are wearing tailored tuxedos, and you came dressed from a discount rack." The suit was actually a gift from Bryce, who had taken me to a real tailor 2 weeks earlier because he wanted me to feel good at the wedding. Facts had never mattered much once my father decided on a version of reality. He was not reacting to my suit. He was performing the role he had assigned me years ago. That was when my Uncle Victor approached us from the bar. He was my father's brother, and I had never heard him speak sharply to him in all the years I had known them. His face was red, but not from alcohol. "That is enough, Richard," he said. "You are embarrassing yourself." My father turned on him immediately. "This is family business, Victor. Stay out of it." Victor did not move. "Mason is family, and you have been doing this to him since he was 8 years old." The number changed my father's expression. Several relatives nearby suddenly became very interested in their plates. An older cousin set down his fork and looked away. My father lowered his voice and hissed, "We agreed never to discuss that." Victor answered, "You agreed. The rest of us watched you tear down one child while spoiling the other 2. Adrian came over in his tuxedo, trying to stop the confrontation before the reception collapsed completely. "Please," he said, "can we just enjoy the evening? This is supposed to be my wedding day." My father's entire face softened the instant he looked at him. "Of course, son," he said warmly. "I was only trying to give a loving toast." The shift was so fast it felt like watching someone flip a switch. The anger and contempt disappeared the second Adrian spoke. And that sudden change told the room more than any explanation could have. He was fully capable of controlling himself when the person in front of him mattered enough. I had simply never been that person to him. Bryce stopped recording and came to stand beside me. "I got everything," he whispered. Then, after glancing toward our father, he added, "I have been recording the way he treats you for 3 years." I turned to him, certain I had misunderstood. Bryce had always played the neutral one in our family, the person who changed the subject when arguments began and disappeared when they became dangerous. "Why?" I asked. He looked ashamed. "Because Uncle Victor is right. Dad has been doing this since Adrian was born, when you were 8. You became the scapegoat the moment he had another son to compare you with. I looked around the ballroom at the abandoned plates, the stiff faces, and the guests pretending to check their phones. For the first time in my life, my father's cruelty had happened in a place where no one could pretend not to see it. My mother appeared a few minutes later and asked me to speak with her outside. We walked into the parking lot, where she took out a cigarette. She only smoked when she was under extreme stress, and I had not seen her do it since my grandfather's funeral. She lit it with shaking hands and stared toward the building before speaking. "Your father is sick," she said. "He has been for years, but he refuses to get help. Doctors believe he has narcissistic personality disorder, and it became much worse after the breakdown he had the year Adrian was born." She explained that my father's own father had died that year, and the family business had nearly collapsed at the same time. Something in him had broken under the pressure, and instead of dealing with the grief and failure, he had attached all of it to me. It was the first time anyone in my family had clearly admitted that something was wrong with him. For 20 years, I had assumed the problem was me. My mother said he had turned Adrian into the golden child, and me into the bad one, while Bryce later became the peacemaker. Once those roles settled in his mind, he stopped seeing us as individual people. Every success Adrian had became proof that Adrian was exceptional. Every mistake I made became proof that I was defective. Even my ordinary choices were treated like moral failures. I asked my mother why no one had stepped in if they had understood what was happening. She said people had tried, but never in a way strong enough to protect me. My grandparents had threatened to cut him off unless he went to therapy. He attended twice, then announced that the therapist was incompetent. Aunt Diane once tried to take me for an entire summer, but my father called the police and accused her of kidnapping me. As she spoke, old memories rearranged themselves into a pattern I had never been allowed to name. When I was 12, my father pushed me into a swimming pool, fully clothed, and later told everyone I had jumped in to show off. He donated my college acceptance letters before I could answer them, which meant I did not learn that 3 schools had accepted me until after the deadlines had passed. He threw birthday parties for my brothers on my birthday and said they deserved double celebrations. When I placed second in the state science fair, he told relatives the judges must have felt sorry for me. The wedding toast was not a sudden loss of control. It was simply the most public version of what he had been doing for years. Then my mother told me something I had not expected. She, Adrian, and Bryce had been meeting with a lawyer and a family therapist for 6 months. They were planning an intervention for the following week. If my father refused intensive treatment, all 3 of his sons would cut contact, and my mother was prepared to separate from him. I could barely process the idea that my brothers had been planning to stand beside me after so many years of silence. When we returned to the reception, the celebration had resumed, but only in the most technical sense. Music was playing again, servers were moving between the tables, and people were making careful conversation. My father sat alone at the head table, because even his own siblings had moved their chairs away from him. Adrian found me before I left, and pressed an envelope into my hand. "Open it later," he said. His face was exhausted, and I did not ask questions. Near the coat check, Bryce pulled me into a quiet corner of the lobby and said he needed to explain the recordings. He had started at my 25th birthday dinner 3 years earlier. I remembered the evening immediately. Our father had spent the entire meal comparing my office job with Adrian's surgical residency. Every course came with another reminder that Adrian was saving lives while I filed reports in a cubicle. Bryce had sat across from me without saying anything, and I had assumed his silence meant agreement. "I watched him tear you apart for 2 hours, Bryce told me. "You just sat there and took it." That was when I realized it would never stop unless someone documented it. From then on, he recorded family dinners, holidays, birthdays, and casual visits whenever our father began targeting me. He opened a folder on his phone and showed me dozens of files, arranged by date. He said that if the family ever confronted our father, he knew he would deny everything, accuse us of exaggerating, or rewrite the event until he became the victim. A recording gave him less room to do that. I stared at 3 years of evidence on the screen and felt anger and gratitude twisting together. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. Bryce's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid. His rage is terrifying, and I did not want to become the next target. I know that sounds cowardly, but I was only 22 when I started. I am not trying to excuse it. I was helping in the only way that felt safe. I wanted to tell him that secret recordings were not the same as protection. I also knew he had grown up in the same damaged house I had. He had survived by smoothing things over, disappearing emotionally, and making himself useful to everyone. His apology did not erase the years when I had stood alone, but I understood the fear behind it. Adrian stopped me again on my way back into the ballroom. He asked whether we could talk the following day after he and Annika returned from their hotel. I agreed, partly because the envelope in my jacket felt heavier every minute. I said goodbye to a few relatives and left before my father could corner me again. The drive to my apartment took about 20 minutes. I replayed the toast the entire way. Every comparison, every lie about the reunion, every cruel word spoken into a microphone while strangers watched. When I opened the door to my studio, it looked exactly as it had that morning. My father had called it a box with a hot plate and treated it as proof that I had failed. Standing inside it that night, I saw something else. It was mine. I paid for it myself. It was quiet, safe, and free from him. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened Adrian's envelope. Inside was a check made out to me for $15,000. Behind it were 3 handwritten pages and a printed document. Adrian's handwriting was neat and controlled, the same kind of handwriting teachers used to praise when we were children, while mine earned criticism. His letter began by saying that he did not trust himself to speak without breaking down or backing out. He had been in therapy for 2 years, working through his guilt and his role in our father's treatment of me. His therapist had helped him understand that he benefited from a system that hurt me, and that staying silent had made him part of it. He listed incidents one by one. He remembered the day our father pushed me into the pool and later claimed I had jumped. Adrian had seen the shove and knew the story was false, but he supported our father's version because he was frightened. He wrote about my college acceptance letters. He had known where they were and could have rescued them, but our father told him I would only embarrass the family if I attended a good school. Adrian said nothing and let the deadlines pass. He remembered blowing out candles at parties held for him and Bryce on my birthday. He felt guilty, but he also liked being the favorite. When I was 16, our father called a family friend and warned him not to hire me for a warehouse job I wanted, claiming I was unreliable. Adrian heard the call and kept quiet. The letter ended without asking me to make him feel better. Adrian wrote that he would understand if I could not forgive him. For 20 years, he had accepted praise, money, opportunities, and affection that were often distributed by taking something away from me. He could not undo that history, but he wanted to stop pretending he had been innocent. The $15,000 check matched exactly what our father had spent on the wedding. Adrian called it symbolic restitution for years of financial favoritism and asked me to use it for something that made me happy. It was not enough to balance 20 years, and he knew that. What mattered was that he had finally named the imbalance instead of benefiting from it silently. The printed document was labeled Intervention Timeline and went back 6 months. It listed meetings between my mother, Adrian, Bryce, and a family therapist named Dr. Elena Morales. The plan was detailed. They would gather evidence of our father's behavior, prepare statements, confront him as a united family, and give him a choice between intensive treatment and complete estrangement from his sons. They had also discussed how to support one another if he retaliated, denied everything, or tried to split them apart. I read the pages twice. While I had continued attending dinners and holidays with no idea that anything would change, my family had been quietly preparing to force the truth into the open. The check lay on the bed beside the letter. $15,000 was more money than I had ever possessed at one time. I should have been thinking about what it could change, but my mind kept circling back to the reception. My father's voice saying I was his greatest disappointment. 200 guests watching, the coordinator reaching for the microphone, Uncle Victor finally defending me, Bryce's hidden archive, my mother admitting that a diagnosis existed, Adrian acknowledging his complicity in writing. I tried to sleep, but around 2 in the morning I turned on the lamp and read the letter again. The phrase symbolic restitution stayed with me because it was more than an apology. Adrian was trying, however imperfectly, to return something after a lifetime in which everything had flowed in his direction. My phone rang at 7 the next morning. Bryce asked whether I had read the letter. When I said yes, he explained why the family had not included me earlier. Dr. Morales believed they first needed to build a stable, united front. Bringing the primary abuse victim into the planning too soon, she warned, could make it easier for our father to manipulate everyone through guilt, fear, or concern for my immediate reaction. Hearing myself described as the primary abuse victim made the situation feel clinical and real in a way I was not prepared for. Bryce asked whether I was all right. I told him I did not know. We met for breakfast at a diner across town, where we were unlikely to see relatives. It was old and quiet, with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone honey. Bryce sat in the back with his phone face down on the table. After we ordered coffee, he said I needed to see what he had recorded. He opened the folder again. There were 47 videos, each labeled with a date, covering 3 years of family events. We began with Thanksgiving from the previous year. Bryce had placed his phone on the table as if he were checking messages, but the camera faced the far end of the dining room. In the recording, our father spent 12 uninterrupted minutes explaining to aunts and uncles why I was the family disappointment. He compared my state education with Adrian's Ivy League degree, my studio apartment with Adrian's house, and my ordinary office job with careers he considered prestigious. I was visible several seats away, quietly moving food around my plate, while he described my life as a list of failures. I did not correct him. I did not leave. I barely reacted. Watching the scene from the outside changed it. My silence no longer looked patient or mature. It looked like the response of someone who had been trained so thoroughly not to defend himself that the instinct had almost disappeared. We watched 3 more videos before the coffee went cold. At Easter dinner, our father spent nearly 20 minutes telling my aunt that I would never marry because I was too damaged to sustain a relationship. His logic made little sense, but nobody challenged him. A recording from my birthday barbecue in July showed him announcing that he had forgotten my birthday because I was not worth remembering. Some relatives laughed because they thought he was joking, yet his expression made it clear that he meant it. The final clip we watched at the diner came from September, after I received a promotion. Bryce had mentioned it to the family, and our father responded that I was probably a pity promotion because I lacked the intelligence to earn it on merit. I had lived through every one of those scenes, but the recordings made them unfamiliar. From inside the moment, I had always concentrated on surviving the next sentence without provoking something worse. From outside, I could see a man repeatedly humiliating his son, while other adults looked away. Bryce closed the folder and admitted that Dr. Morales had forced him to examine his own role as the peacemaker. Changing the subject, calming our father down, and pretending to remain neutral had not protected the family. It had protected the person causing the harm. By preserving the appearance of peace, Bryce had left me without an ally. Over the next 2 days, I watched all 47 recordings from a copy Bryce sent to my laptop. Most lasted between 5 and 20 minutes. Together, they were devastating. In the earliest clips, I occasionally tried to correct a lie or defend a decision. By the most recent recordings, I simply sat still and absorbed whatever came. I had learned to shrink, to become quiet enough that perhaps he would lose interest and move on. The videos showed how completely I had accepted cruelty as normal. They also revealed the structure of his attacks. He usually began with a small criticism that sounded almost ordinary. Then he widened it into a judgment about my intelligence, appearance, ambition, or character. He compared me with my brothers, listed old failures, predicted that I would end up alone, and presented his contempt as concern. The details varied, but the pattern stayed almost identical. Relatives often exchanged uncomfortable looks or stared at their plates, yet almost no one interrupted. I had not lacked witnesses. I had been surrounded by witnesses who chose silence. On Wednesday, I called Dr. Morales. She answered after 2 rings, and we spoke for about 90 minutes. She explained that my presence at the intervention was not required. The family could confront my father without me, and I did not owe anyone another painful performance simply because they had finally decided to act. At the same time, she said my participation could be powerful if I chose it for myself. I had spent most of my life arranging my behavior around other people's comfort. This was one of the first decisions I could make, based entirely on what might help me heal. She asked what I feared would happen if I attended. I told her I was afraid my father would somehow make the intervention my fault, as he had made almost everything else my fault. I feared that even with the recordings, relatives would retreat once he became angry. I feared speaking openly, and then discovering that nothing had changed. Dr. Morales listened without interrupting. Then she asked what I feared would happen if I stayed away. The answer came more slowly. I knew I might spend the rest of my life wondering whether I had given up my only chance to be heard by the entire family at once. Both fears were reasonable, she said. The intervention would happen either way. The real question was whether I wanted to be present in my own story or remain outside it while other people described what had happened to me. During the final part of the call, she role-played several situations with me. She showed me how to stay calm when my father tried to provoke me, how to redirect when he claimed to be the victim, and how to respond when he used his familiar lines, that I was too sensitive, that I was lying, or that he had only pushed me because he wanted me to improve. I did not need to argue every detail. I did not need to prove my worth. The recordings already established the pattern. My task was simply to state what I had lived through and refuse to let him redefine it. By the end of the conversation, I was still frightened, but the fear had edges I could understand. I decided to participate. For 20 years, my father's version of events had been treated as the official record, even when everyone knew parts of it were false. The intervention would not guarantee an apology or a transformation, but it would force the family to hear my experience without allowing him to interrupt and erase it. That alone mattered. Later that afternoon, My mother asked me to come to her office downtown for a family meeting. She worked as an accountant in a building near the courthouse. When I reached the 7th floor conference room, Adrian was already there in jeans and a sweater, his hair pushed back as though he had barely slept. Bryce sat beside him. Uncle Victor was across the table with a folder of papers spread in front of him. My mother introduced him as the family's truth teller and witness. Victor gave a sad smile and said someone needed to remember what had actually happened, because my father had spent years rewriting history. A laptop on the table was connected to a video call. Dr. Morales appeared on the screen and formally introduced herself to me, Adrian, Victor, and Bryce. She specialized in narcissistic family systems and had been working with my mother and brothers for 6 months. Her goal was not to diagnose my father from a distance or excuse him with a label. The diagnosis already existed in his medical history. Her role was to help the rest of us stop participating in the patterns that allowed his behavior to continue. She reviewed the intervention step by step. First, the family would gather and show my father selected recordings that demonstrated a consistent pattern. Then, each person would read a prepared statement describing specific actions and their effect. Finally, the family would present information about treatment programs and establish a clear boundary. He could enter intensive treatment and remain connected to us under strict conditions, or he could refuse and lose contact with his sons. My mother was prepared to separate from him if he rejected help. Dr. Morales explained that the breakdown around the year Adrian was born appeared to have caused a severe break in my father's perception of himself and the family. His father had died, the business was close to collapsing, and he could not tolerate the shame and grief attached to those losses. I was 8 years old at the time, and for reasons rooted in his own distorted thinking, I became the person onto whom he projected failure. She believed I reminded him of the younger version of himself, who had been unable to save his father or his business. Rather than face that powerless version of himself, he treated me as though I embodied everything he hated. Over the following 20 years, the roles hardened. Adrian became proof that my father was a successful parent. I became proof that someone else was responsible whenever he felt disappointed. Bryce became the person who managed tension without challenging the structure. Dr. Morales said these roles were common in families organized around a narcissistic parent, but common did not mean harmless. The system had protected my father from accountability by distributing the cost among the rest of us. Uncle Victor cleared his throat and began speaking without looking directly at anyone. He admitted that he had confronted my mother privately for at least 15 years. He saw my father push me into the pool and then lie. He knew about the college letters. He had heard my father call me worthless while I sat at the same table. Every time he raised the issue, my mother said she did not want to make things worse, or believed she could manage the situation until my father calmed down. Victor's voice cracked when he apologized to me. He said he should have called someone, should have offered me a permanent place in his home, and should have risked a family war rather than watch a child be destroyed slowly. He had been afraid of losing his brother, and that fear had cost me protection. Dr. Morales returned the meeting to the plan for Saturday. We would gather at Aunt Diane's house. Diane volunteered because she had stopped caring whether my father felt comfortable after the kidnapping accusation years earlier. Several members of the extended family would attend, both to support the boundary and to confirm events they had witnessed. Dr. Morales would facilitate so that my father could not take control of the conversation, simply by becoming louder. The treatment options were already being researched. One program lasted 8 weeks and involved daily individual therapy and group sessions while allowing him to live at home. Another lasted 3 months and included a 4-week residential phase. The third continued for 6 months, with twice-weekly sessions and family therapy during the second half. All 3 focused on personality disorders, narcissistic patterns, family systems, and underlying trauma. My mother's insurance would pay most of the cost, removing the financial excuse he would otherwise use. The boundary had to be specific enough to survive his attempts to negotiate around it. Agreeing to treatment and quitting after a few sessions would count as refusal. Completing a program while continuing to blame me would not be accepted as change. If he rejected the options, my mother would file separation papers, his sons would block him, and extended relatives would stop inviting him to holidays. Dr. Morales warned us to expect rage, denial, accusations of betrayal, sudden tears, and efforts to divide the room. We had all spent years responding to those tactics automatically. The intervention would only work if we stopped. When the call ended, Victor gave me his phone number and told me I could call at any hour. My mother hugged me in the parking garage and held on longer than she ever had before. That evening, Bryce came to my apartment with a notebook and his laptop so we could write our statements. For nearly 20 minutes, we sat on the couch staring at blank pages. Doctor Morales had instructed us to focus on concrete events and honest effects, but every memory seemed too large to fit into a sentence. I began with the pool because it remained one of the clearest moments of my childhood. I was 12, at a family barbecue, standing near the deep end while fully dressed. My father shoved me without warning. I was not a strong swimmer. I swallowed water, panicked, and flailed while people on the deck watched in confusion. Uncle Victor jumped in and pulled me out. I vomited pool water onto the concrete while my father told everyone that I had been showing off and slipped. Adrian had seen the shove and supported the lie. My mother wrapped me in a towel and did not challenge him. I wrote it in plain language. My father pushed me. I nearly drowned. He lied about it. Adrian lied too. I was terrified, and I did not understand why the adults around me treated the truth as more dangerous than what had happened. The simplicity made the event harder to escape. My father had spent years surrounding it with explanations. On paper, stripped of his version, it was exactly what it had always been. Bryce showed me what he had written about being the peacemaker. He described a Christmas dinner 3 years earlier when our father criticized my job, apartment, clothes, and future for most of the evening. Bryce tried to change the subject 5 times. When each attempt failed, he went silent because openly defending me would have made our father angrier. In the statement, he called that silence a betrayal. He had once believed keeping the peace was the kindest thing he could do. Therapy had taught him that there was no real peace when one person had to absorb all the violence for everyone else. We worked for 3 hours. We wrote about the college letters, the birthday parties, the lie at the reunion after my grandfather fell, and the warehouse job my father destroyed with a phone call. Each memory connected to another. None of them had seemed important enough, on its own, to justify tearing apart the family. Together, they showed that the family had already been torn apart. We had simply organized our lives around the damage. The following morning, my mother met me at a downtown coffee shop, carrying a thick folder. Inside were records from my father's brief attempts at treatment in 2009 and 2011. Years earlier, he had signed a medical power of attorney for insurance purposes, which allowed my mother to request the records. The diagnosis appeared in black and white: narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features. His psychiatrist, Dr. Marcus Reed, had documented my father's distorted perception of me, his refusal to accept responsibility, and his habit of blaming other people for his emotional state. Dr. Reed had recommended individual therapy twice a week, along with medication. My father attended 4 sessions and stopped. He later told the family that the psychiatrist was incompetent and biased against fathers who maintained high standards for their sons. My mother's hands shook as she turned the pages. She had known about the diagnosis for 14 years. She had also known that the recommended treatment had never been completed. I asked why she had waited so long. She said she was afraid of his rage and afraid that divorce would cost her access to her children. She convinced herself that she could protect us in small ways and limit the damage without destroying the family. The wedding showed her that management had failed. He had escalated from private attacks to humiliating me in front of 200 people, and she could no longer pretend that patience would turn him into someone else. Then I asked the question I had carried since childhood. Did you ever believe the things he said about me? She stared at the table for a long time before answering. No, not once. That should have comforted me. Instead, it created a different kind of pain. She had known I was not lazy, stupid, selfish, or defective, yet she had remained quiet while those labels became the foundation of my identity. She said that was the worst part of her guilt. She had known the truth and chosen silence because silence seemed safer. That afternoon, Adrian came to my apartment carrying 2 coffees. He sat on the couch and told me what had happened during the wedding planning. Our father tried to control nearly every decision. The venue was not prestigious enough, the colors were wrong, the guest list included too many of Annika's relatives, and the vendors were not worthy of the family. Annika's parents noticed the pattern during planning meetings and gradually excluded him from important decisions. Eventually, they told him he could attend the wedding as a guest, but would no longer participate as a planner. That boundary enraged him. He began insulting Annika's family, calling them low class, and warning Adrian that the marriage would damage his social standing. Adrian finally told him that another insult would cost him his invitation. Our father became quiet for 2 weeks. Then he arrived at the reception with the humiliating speech prepared. Adrian believed the toast was retaliation for losing control of the wedding. He could not openly punish Adrian, because the golden child had to remain golden. So he redirected the rage toward the person he had always considered safe to attack: me. Adrian said the revenge should have landed on him, not on me. He had been the one who set the boundary. He had spent his entire life on the winning side of our father's system, and he was done accepting that advantage. His words did not repair the past. but they showed that he finally understood the mechanism. My father did not simply prefer one son. He needed one son elevated and another degraded so that his own position at the center of the family remained secure. That evening, Uncle Victor called with more details about Aunt Diane. She had been prepared to host an intervention for at least 5 years. When I was 13, she invited me to spend a month with her family because she could see how desperate I was to get away. She planned ordinary things: swimming lessons, library trips, afternoons at the lake, and time in a home where no one criticized me every few minutes. On the third day, my father called the police and reported that she had kidnapped me. Officers came to Diane's house and questioned both of us. I told them I wanted to stay, but my father insisted I had been manipulated. Because he was my parent and Diane had no legal authority to keep me, I was taken home. She explored legal options afterward, but he threatened to seek a restraining order and said he would make sure she never saw any of us again. Diane backed down, not because she believed him, but because she feared losing every connection to the family. Victor said she had carried that failure for years. The moment my mother asked to use her house, she agreed. The night before the intervention, I could barely eat. My stomach remained tight, and my hands shook whenever I thought about facing my father. Bryce arrived around 8 with bags of snacks and a laptop full of movies. We tried to watch a comedy, but I could not follow the plot. Every time my attention drifted, I saw my father at the reception, smiling with satisfaction, while the room watched him reduce my life to a joke. Bryce paused the movie and asked what frightened me most. I told him I was still afraid our father would turn the entire meeting around and make me responsible. I was afraid relatives would believe him despite the recordings. I was afraid that after exposing everything, I would return to the same life with nothing changed. Bryce reminded me that our mother and Adrian had committed themselves before I agreed to attend. The confrontation was not depending on my performance. I did not have to win the room. I only had to tell the truth. We stayed awake until nearly 3 in the morning, eating snacks and barely watching the screen. Bryce eventually fell asleep on the couch. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about what the next day might take from me. I also thought about what it might return: the right to describe my own childhood without asking permission from the person who had distorted it. Saturday morning felt unreal. I showered and put on comfortable clothes because Dr. Morales warned that the meeting could last for hours. Bryce and I drove to Aunt Diane's together. Neither of us said much. We arrived at 10 and found the living room arranged with chairs in a circle. My mother looked exhausted. Adrian sat near the window with Annika beside him. Uncle Victor stood by the fireplace speaking quietly with Diane. 2 of my father's sisters were there, along with another uncle who had attended many family gatherings but almost never entered an argument. Dr. Morales arrived carrying a briefcase and greeted each person before asking us to sit. No one made small talk. She reviewed the structure one final time. My mother would explain why we were there. Bryce would show selected recordings. Each person would read a statement without interruption. Then Dr. Morales would present the treatment programs and the consequences of refusal. She reminded us that my father might shout, leave, cry, threaten, accuse, or try to recruit one person against the rest. Our responsibility was not to calm him. It was to remain united. If he refused treatment, the boundaries would begin immediately. My mother would proceed with separation. Adrian, Bryce, and I would end contact. Extended relatives would stop including him in gatherings. Dr. Morales looked around the circle and asked whether everyone understood. One by one, we nodded. My heartbeat was so loud that I could hear it in my ears. At 11, my father's silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched him check his hair in the rearview mirror before stepping out. My mother had invited him to what she described as a casual family brunch. He approached the house smiling. Diane opened the door, and the smile disappeared the moment he saw the chairs, Dr. Morales, and 10 serious faces waiting for him. His expression moved from confusion to suspicion to rage within seconds. He looked at my mother. "What is this?" She gestured toward the empty chair. "We need to talk." He began backing toward the door. "This is a setup. I am not staying for an ambush." Uncle Victor moved between him and the exit. His voice remained calm. "You need to hear what we have to say. If you leave now, you will lose contact with your sons." My father stared at him as though he had been struck. "You cannot threaten me and my own family." Victor did not move. "This is not a threat. We are telling you what will happen next." For a long moment, my father stood in the entryway breathing hard. Then he walked stiffly to the empty chair and sat with his arms crossed. I recognized the expression on his face. Defensive rage combined with the concentration he used when planning a counterattack. Dr. Morales introduced herself and explained that we were gathered because his behavior had harmed the family, particularly his treatment of me. He interrupted before she finished. "This is an ambush. You are all ganging up on me the way you always do. Her voice remained level. We are here because your behavior toward Mason has caused serious harm for 20 years. We have evidence we want you to see. His eyes found mine across the circle and turned cold. Of course this is about Mason, he said. He has always been the problem, and now he has turned all of you against me. Bryce placed his laptop on the coffee table and opened the folder of recordings. Dr. Morales nodded, and he began with the Thanksgiving video. My father's voice filled the room as the screen showed him sitting at the head of the table, talking about my career while I sat 4 seats away. For 12 minutes, the recording captured him comparing my job with Adrian's medical training and Bryce's graduate program. He listed my supposed failures, questioned my ambition, and predicted that I would never progress beyond my current position. The camera also captured the rest of us. I pushed food around my plate and said nothing. Relatives shifted, looked at one another, and allowed him to continue. The man sitting in Diane's living room watched himself with his arms still crossed. At first, his expression was openly defiant. As the uninterrupted clip continued, the color slowly left his face. He could not claim the sentence had been isolated or edited, because the timestamp showed the full 12 minutes. His own voice established the context. When the Thanksgiving recording ended, Bryce opened a Christmas video from 2 years earlier. Again, our father presented a long explanation of why I worried and disappointed him while I sat within hearing distance. Bryce played 5 additional clips. Across holidays, birthdays, and ordinary dinners, the details changed, but the behavior did not. My father criticized my apartment, car, clothes, education, work, personality, and future. He used the same mixture of pity and contempt each time. By the 5th recording, 2 of my aunts were crying. Uncle Victor sat with his head in his hands. My father's face shifted through anger, disbelief, calculation, and something that looked close to fear. When the final clip stopped, Dr. Morales asked whether he understood what he had seen. He opened his mouth and closed it again. For once, there was no immediate explanation. My mother unfolded her statement. Her hands trembled as she began. She apologized to me for failing to protect me for 20 years. She told the room that fear of my father's rage had made her complicit. She described the pool incident, when she wrapped me in a towel but allowed him to lie about pushing me. She remembered discovering my college letters in the recycling and putting them back because confronting him felt dangerous. She admitted that every time she preserved the appearance of peace, I paid the price. Then she looked directly at my father. Your treatment of our son is abusive, and it must stop. If you refuse treatment, I will file for separation. I will not spend another year watching you destroy him. My father tried to respond, but Dr. Morales raised a hand and told him he would have time after everyone finished. My mother folded her pages and looked at me through tears. Her apology did not return my childhood, but hearing her name the truth publicly mattered more than I expected. Adrian stood next. His paper shook in his hands. He said he had benefited from being the golden child while I suffered as the scapegoat. Nearly every compliment from our father contained an implied or direct insult toward me. Every achievement celebrated in Adrian became another instrument used to make me feel inferior. The favoritism damaged both of us, though not equally. It gave Adrian a false sense of superiority that he had spent years unlearning, while teaching me that I was fundamentally less worthy. He admitted that he should have defended me when we were children, teenagers, and adults. He described seeing our father push me into the pool and supporting the lie. He described listening on another telephone extension while our father destroyed the warehouse job I wanted. He said he was ashamed that it took him until adulthood to reject the system that favored him. I cannot be the golden child anymore, he told our father. That role only exists if someone else has to be the scapegoat, and I will not keep accepting love that depends on hurting my brother. When Adrian sat down, he was crying. I realized I was crying too. Bryce stood near the window and read about his role as the peacemaker. Our father's anger had trained him to choose between protecting me and preventing an explosion. For years, he chose quiet because it seemed like the only way to survive. He spoke about secretly recording 47 incidents while lacking the courage to intervene openly. The recordings had been an attempt to help, but they also documented his silence. Bryce told our father that he was finished prioritizing his comfort over basic decency. He would no longer attend an event where I was mistreated. He would keep copies of the recordings, and any future abuse would be documented rather than hidden. When he finished, he crossed the circle, sat beside me, and took my hand. Uncle Victor stood with his statement in one hand and his reading glasses in the other. His voice was steady as he described watching the abuse continue for 2 decades. He named the pool incident, the college letters that closed doors before I knew they had opened, and the birthday celebrations taken from me and handed to my brothers. He told my father that everyone in the room had witnessed pieces of the pattern and that each of them carried responsibility for allowing it to continue. Victor admitted that private objections had not been enough. He had confronted my mother for 15 years, but he should have confronted my father publicly. He should have been louder. He should have refused to protect the family's ugliest secret. Then he said something none of us had said so directly before. Your diagnosis may explain part of your behavior, Richard, but it does not erase your responsibility. What you did was abuse. You have to face that, without hiding behind illness, stress, or good intentions. When he sat down, he looked at me and silently mouthed, "I am sorry." Aunt Diane stood without notes. Her anger was controlled, but only barely. She returned to the summer when she tried to give me a month away from home. She remembered how relieved I looked during the first evening at her house, and how quickly that relief ended when police arrived on the third day. She told my father that reporting a kidnapping had not been protective parenting. It had been a way to maintain control over a frightened 13-year-old who wanted distance from him. She had planned swimming lessons, library visits, and ordinary family outings because she wanted me to experience life without constant criticism. Instead, my father used the police and the threat of a restraining order to force me home and silence her. Diane said she had never forgiven him for valuing control more than my safety. She had watched me change from an energetic 8-year-old who built model rockets in her backyard into a quiet 28-year-old who believed mistreatment was normal. The wedding toast, she said, was only the public version of what he had done privately for years. When Diane sat down, she wiped her eyes hard with the heel of her hand. I was the last person scheduled to speak. My statement was 3 pages long, but it felt much heavier when I stood. My hands shook so badly that Bryce rose and held the pages steady while I read. I told my father what it had been like to grow up, believing I was fundamentally broken. Every comparison with Adrian or Bryce taught me that I was less intelligent, less capable, less disciplined, and less deserving of affection. Every criticism rested on the one before it until I could no longer see myself directly. I saw myself through his eyes, as the disappointment, the weak son, and the person whose failures explained everything wrong in the family. I described the therapy I had started 3 years earlier. I had not begun because I understood that he was abusive. I began because I believed I needed help becoming less effective. Slowly, my therapist helped me separate my actual life from the story my father told about it. I had a steady job, paid my own rent, earned a promotion, maintained friendships, and survived years of treatment that would have broken many people. None of those facts matched the useless man he described. Then I spoke about the wedding. Hearing him call me his greatest disappointment in front of 200 guests felt like public confirmation of my oldest fear, that everyone secretly agreed with him. But the silence in that room had not meant agreement. The guests were stunned by his cruelty. The coordinator tried twice to stop him. His own brother confronted him. My brothers began speaking openly. The moment he intended as my humiliation became the moment his behavior could no longer remain hidden. I do not know whether I can forgive you, I said. But I know I cannot keep accepting this. Your opinion of me is not the truth, and I will not organize the rest of my life around it. By the time I finished, my voice was barely above a whisper, and tears had soaked the pages. For one long breath, no one moved. My father's face had changed repeatedly, while 6 family members described his actions. He tried to interrupt my mother and Adrian, but Dr. Morales stopped him each time. By the end of my statement, rage, denial, and something resembling shame moved across his expression. His mouth opened and closed. Then he found the response he had used all his life. He exploded out of his chair and shouted that we were all against him. He pointed at me and accused me of poisoning the family, playing the victim, and manipulating everyone into believing lies. He said he had only tried to push me to become better, and that I was turning strict parenting into abuse because I could not handle criticism. According to him, the recordings had been taken out of context. He suggested that I had instructed Bryce what to capture and when to capture it. The entire intervention, he insisted, was another attempt by me to become the center of attention. Uncle Victor stood, folded his arms, and waited until the shouting paused. We watched your own words come out of your own mouth, he said. 47 separate recordings over 3 years are not a misunderstanding. Mason did not create your behavior. He did not have to. My father turned toward Bryce and called him a traitor for recording his own father like a spy. Bryce did not flinch. He reopened the laptop and selected a file my father had never known existed. It was an audio recording from a car ride 2 years earlier. My father had believed he was alone with Bryce. For 4 minutes, his voice explained that he had always known I would amount to nothing, and that he invited me to family events only, so relatives would not ask uncomfortable questions. There was no argument in the background, no provocation, and no audience to impress. It was simply what he believed when he thought I would never hear it. The room became completely still. My father had no answer, so he changed tactics. His shoulders dropped, his voice broke, and he began to cry. He said he had always done his best, and that we were ungrateful for everything he sacrificed. He listed the jobs he had worked, the mortgage he had paid, and the school events he had attended. He said being a father was difficult, and accused us of throwing him away over a few comments made during stressful moments. He insisted he was not perfect, but had loved us and provided for us. Then he searched the circle for a sympathetic face. He turned first to Adrian. "You know I am not a monster. We had good times together." Adrian looked down for a moment, then answered that the good times were part of the problem. They existed because someone else was absorbing the cruelty that allowed my father to be warm with him. Adrian could no longer celebrate a relationship built on my suffering. My father turned to Victor next and said brothers were supposed to protect each other. Victor replied that protecting the family was exactly what he was finally doing. Before my father could choose another person to pressure, Diane stood and began listing specific acts that could not be explained as stress or imperfect parenting. She named the pool, the donated acceptance letters, the birthday parties, the false kidnapping report, the science fair insult, the warehouse job, and the lie about my grandfather's fall while I was calling for an ambulance. Each event was concrete. Each had witnesses. One by one, the relatives who had remained quiet began adding what they knew. 2 aunts confirmed incidents they had seen. The uncle who had rarely spoken admitted that he stopped hosting Thanksgiving because he could no longer tolerate watching my father attack me at his table. He had never told anyone the real reason. One of my father's sisters said she had carried guilt for 16 years because she stood beside the pool and said nothing after he pushed me. The testimonies accumulated until denial became impossible. No single person controlled the story anymore. My father sat lower in his chair as his own siblings confirmed the pattern. The rage drained from his face and was replaced by fear. He had spent decades surviving every challenge by isolating the person who confronted him. This time, there was no isolated person. The entire family had compared memories, preserved evidence, and agreed on the same boundary. Dr. Morales allowed the silence to settle. Then she opened her briefcase and placed 3 folders on the coffee table. She explained the treatment options in practical terms. The first program lasted 8 weeks and included daily individual therapy and group work while allowing him to live at home. The second lasted 3 months, beginning with 4 weeks in a residential setting. The third extended over 6 months, with twice-weekly sessions and family therapy during the second half. All 3 programs specialized in personality disorders, narcissistic behavior, family systems, and the trauma beneath those patterns. My mother's insurance would cover most of the expense. Money would not be an excuse. Dr. Morales told him that choosing a program was only the beginning. If he enrolled and quit once the immediate pressure passed, the consequences would be the same as refusing. If he attended but continued blaming me or minimizing what he had done, the family would not treat that as recovery. Then she stated the choice. He could commit to intensive treatment and begin the difficult work of changing, or he could lose contact with his sons and face separation from my mother. The decision belonged to him, but the consequences belonged to us. She went around the circle and asked each person to confirm the boundary allowed. My mother said the separation documents had already been prepared. Adrian and Bryce said they would block his number that afternoon if he refused. I said I would end contact as well. Victor, Diane, and the other relatives stated that he would no longer be invited to holidays or family gatherings. Voice after voice removed another escape route. There was no one left for him to recruit as an ally. In a voice smaller than I had ever heard from him, my father asked what refusal would mean for future grandchildren. Dr. Morales answered plainly. His sons would not expose their children to the treatment I had endured. Without genuine change, he would have no relationship with future grandchildren. That consequence landed harder than anything else. He stared down at the folders and stopped arguing. Dr. Morales suggested that he spend 20 minutes alone considering the options. The rest of us left through the back door and gathered in Diane's yard. Through the window, I could see my father sitting on the couch with the program descriptions spread around him. His hands shook as he picked up each folder and read. My mother stood beside me on the patio and lit another cigarette, even though she had already smoked twice that morning. Adrian and Annika spoke quietly near the steps. My aunts and uncles formed a group by the fence. No one knew whether my father would agree to treatment or simply choose the path that allowed him to preserve his pride. I watched him through the glass and wondered whether he understood the damage or was merely calculating which option would cost him less. The 20 minutes felt like an hour. When we returned to the living room, he looked different. His shoulders had collapsed forward, and the hard expression he wore through most of the meeting was gone. Surrounded by the treatment folders, He looked smaller and more fragile than the man who had shouted at all of us earlier. He looked across the circle and asked whether I truly believed he had been abusive. For the first time that day, his eyes met mine without obvious contempt. I answered yes. The evidence was not ambiguous. His treatment had damaged me since I was 8 years old. The wedding toast was not an isolated mistake. It was the public version of what he had said privately for 20 years. I told him that every comparison with my brothers had taught me I was less intelligent, less capable, and less worthy of love. I explained that I had spent 3 years in therapy, learning that his perception of me was not reality. He flinched at that sentence, as if it hurt more than any accusation. My father began crying again, but this time the tears did not immediately turn into a speech about his sacrifices. His face folded, and he covered it with both hands. He said he did not remember the past being as severe as the videos showed. In his mind, he believed he had been motivating me in the same harsh way his own father had motivated him. Dr. Morales moved closer and explained that narcissistic personality disorder can distort memory and perception. His mind had built a version of events that protected him from seeing himself as cruel. That distortion was not proof that no harm occurred. It was one reason intensive treatment was necessary. He asked whether he was truly that sick and whether he could have hurt his own son so badly without understanding it. Yes, she said, the harm is real and it is documented. Acknowledging that is the first honest step you have taken today. My father lowered his hands. His face was wet, and his palms rested open in his lap as though he had finally exhausted every defense. He looked at me and whispered, "I am sorry." I did not answer. After 20 years, words were not enough, and I was no longer responsible for rescuing him from the discomfort of what he had done. For the first time in my life, the entire room remained silent and waited for me, rather than waiting for my father to tell everyone what they should believe about me. The next words, whatever they would be, belonged to me,